So today we're going to switch back to Shilas Teshuvos for the sake of variety, and we're going to return to the concept of searching for this date, today's date, in the history of Shilas Teshuvos. But on this occasion, I don't have any one particular tshuva topic in mind here to focus on. Instead, I'm going to attempt to do more of a survey. We're going to do an overview of this date in Halachic history throughout the generations. Now, depending on the date, some dates might have 100 plus tshuvas that show up for that date. Some may have less. This date seems to have less, somewhere in the area of 50, depends how you count. And moreover, some dates, if you're lucky, you might find stuff even from a very early point, from the Rajba, from the Rivash, from pretty early dates. So then it's interesting to see stuff from the Kufs, the Reishas, or even, I guess, the Hays before you got to Kuf. But that's usually about the earliest you'll get in terms of searching for dates in this type of literature. However, in this case, it happens to be the stuff we have doesn't go that far back. Of course, I'm not going to quote every single one. That wouldn't be possible, and not all of them are equally as interesting. Instead, I'm going to focus on the ones that I thought were particularly interesting. Of course, there are dargas to that as well. Interestingly, it's worth noting that when it comes to the date, Tezayin Sivan, interestingly, the convention of using Tes Zayin to represent the number 16 is actually far later than the convention of using Tes Vav to represent 15. Tes Vav started earlier. I don't have the exact dates in front of me, but it's something I've looked into before. But Tes Zayin, if you start paying attention, you'll notice that Rishonim for sure say Yud Vav instead of Tes Zayin. And it seems that Yud Vav was still in use potentially as late as perhaps the early 1800s, meaning it wasn't fully accepted, fully consistent. And then at some point, Tezayin completely replaced Yud Vav. So that's both in terms of dates or in terms of being mitzayin to numbers, simonim, whatever the case may be. So in fact, in this case, the earliest one that I saw, if you want to search for the date, you have to keep in mind that you have to search for Yud Vav and not just for Tezayin. So in this case, the earliest one was indeed maybe from the Reishas or the Shins that had Yud Vav Sivan in it, but that didn't happen to be too interesting, so we're not going to talk about it beyond mentioning that you have to search for that form of the number of the date as well. But we're going to start with a tshuva from the year Taf Kuf Chav Beis, which would be the year 1762, so even the earliest one here is not that long ago. And this is a tshuva in She'elas Yavitz, the tshuvas of Rabbi Yaakov Emden, Chelik Beis, Siman Kufid Gimel. Now with Rabbi Yaakov Emden, it's hard to find tshuvas that aren't interesting, even if the topic itself isn't hugely interesting. Usually he finds ways to make it interesting, make it exciting, make it personal, and we're always big fans of Rabbi Yaakov Emden here. In this case, the topic itself is actually pretty interesting, and Rabbi Yaakov Emden's contribution is not so great. It's fairly short, as we'll see. We'll try to keep things short here due to time constraints, and we'll see how many additional pieces we cover here. But this is a shaila he received Chav Gimel Sivan Taf Kuf Chav Beis, so a few days later than this date. But as we'll see, within the shaila there are documents, and one of those documents is dated Tezayin Sivan, so that comes up as well. That counts as well for the purposes of this concept. And in fact, sometimes these documents that are preserved within tshuvas are themselves quite fascinating. But since I don't want to get stuck fully in introduction mode, so we're going to jump into the shaila, and then we'll get to the documents a bit further in, and then we'll talk about that when we get there. So this shaila is from someone by the name of Shmaya Halevi of Hamburg. Interestingly, as we'll see, his name is really tied to three different places. So this shaila is actually being sent from a place called Bickeburg. If you search Bickeburg in German, so that's B-U with an umlaut, Ckeburg. So it does seem to be some shtetl in Germany somewhere. Didn't check exactly where on the map. But certainly not an Ir Ve'ein B'Yisrael. Certainly a smaller community, and that's nagea to the shaila that's going to come up here. But the person writing does seem to be a dayan, a ben Torah, someone who's able to ask a serious shaila, although we'll see in Rabbi Yaakov Emden's response that at least at one point he was surprised by the halachic assumptions the shoel was making. But certainly the person writing has the nusach, the sprach of the Talmud Chacham with all the lashonos and the malitzas. So certainly a ben Torah for sure. And it begins with very illustrious titles. B'chlal, it's always a subplot with Rabbi Yaakov Emden, the titles people are writing to him. And I don't want to personalize it too much and start talking about Rabbi Yaakov Emden like a pal, but Rabbi Yaakov Emden himself is a lot more forward about his feelings and about other people's feelings. It's just a lot more front and center. And so you pick up sometimes on the fact that he does seem to be sensitive to the Lashonis people write to him. And the history of writing Lashonis and Shuvas has its own interesting history. Today, there's certain standardized titles, but usually people don't write the flowery Lashonis anymore. Whereas certainly in these shuvas you'll see it could be have 4, 5, 6 lines of lashonos and titles. Lemia shaloi kol chemdas Yisrael yishmereu hakel harehu ha'erez asher balavanoin, etc., etc. But addressed to Rabbi Yaakov Emden, and the person writing the sort of Shmaya, he says, ever since Umdi al Daiti, as long as I've been aware, self-conscious, as long as I've reached the knowledge that I have, so I've always been misabik bafar agli chachamim lumer almanas lamed lushmer velasas ulekayim, and to be metaken whatever is mekulkal. And now I'm so grateful to Hashem that I was able to unmask the big michshel, the big machshela here in Bickerburg. Shekan nimtza v'kan hoya ish echad, it is Aaron, and he gives him a short title of Kaf apostrophe, which I believe is short for Kimar, which I guess is the lowest sort of respectable title. I guess Reb was considered, so it would be interesting to go study exactly the conventions, but I'm not sure if Reb, Reish apostrophe wasn't used or not, or whether that would have been considered even more disrespectful. But anyway, he uses Kaf apostrophe here. Kmar Aaron ben Harav Reb Tzvi. So I guess the father gets a little bit more covet. But this Aaron ben Tzvi shochet v'shatz poi in Bickerburg. So we're dealing with a shtetl. You can look up Bickerburg Jewish community. There always are resources online about the history of Jewish communities. So you could see more or less when the community was founded, etc., etc. It seems like it was very small. So it's not clear if they always had someone who was mamish or rav and are based in dayan caliber or not. Perhaps not. So it seems like perhaps previously this sort of Adam shochet v'shatz may have been the most chashuv person there, and then maybe this Shmaya Levi came down to town and is now undermining the stature of this previous guy. We know certainly in early America there almost were never rabbanim of rabbinic caliber, but often the highest you found was a shochet v'shatz, precisely that type of level, and in early America that may have been called a reverend. So it sounds like this Reb Aaron was, you could say, the reverend of Bickerburg, and as we'll see, the stuff that he contributed to the Jewish life of the community. And now this Reb Shmai is here to unmask him, to uncover a scandal. And he says, you'll see, I attached the Gvius Eidos, and we'll explain what that is. Those are the documents I was referring to. We have Eidos, we have testimony that was given before a Beis Din Tzedek. We'll get to the Beis Din Tzedek. And I would like to discuss what, in light of what we've uncovered about him, we need to figure out what the halachas are in terms of kashrus, in terms of other things. So I'm going to jump here, even though he sort of continues posing his question, but if you don't see the Gvius Eidos first, it's hard to know what he's referring to. In the Sefer, the Gvius Eidos is attached afterwards. So what's Gvius Eidos? So Gvius Eidos is this idea: witnesses come to Beis Din, and Beis Din create a record. They transcribe the testimony of the witnesses. Now, one of the reasons why I find these things very interesting. So first of all, it's a different genre. You have a shaila, a tshuva. That's one thing. A document is just something else. And sometimes shailas and tshuvas preserve other kinds of documents. They preserve the nusach of contracts between people and stuff like that. That is also interesting, and those will also come up in searches. Sometimes for the date, you'll see a document, a contract with a date, a day, a month, a year. But you also have the Gvius Eidos, and Gvius Eidos in particular became very interesting because at some point, many hundreds of years ago, sometime around perhaps the 1400s, it became the convention in Ashkenazi Bati Din that if someone came and provided edus on a serious matter, and they transcribed it, they recorded it, and perhaps they needed to forward it to a greater rabbi, they were actually makbid to write down what the person said in the language that they said it as they said it. So often gvius edus in Shalos Tshuvos will be in Yiddish. And this is actually very interesting. I don't think I've introduced this before. If I have, forgive me. But this is very interesting and important because for those that are interested in Yiddish and interested in Yiddish, not just in the last 20, 50 years, 100 years, but long term to understand and trace how the language of Yiddish developed and evolved over the centuries. So the question is, what sources of Yiddish do we have the further you go back? So there are certain Sfarim that were written in Yiddish. Of course, there's the subject of Taich, which is its own entire category. But what's been observed, what's been noted, is that we don't really have, until 150 years ago, or whatever date you want to date the modern Yiddish literary phenomenon to, up until then, you didn't have stam, casual writing, you didn't have transcriptions of people's dialogue. So you could have a sefer written 500 years ago in Yiddish, but Sfarim are always written in a certain tone, in a certain register, and it represents a very specific type of writing, but that's not telling you how people conversed on the street. So what's fascinating about the Gvias Edus in Shuvas, often about Agunas, but sometimes in other topics as well, as we'll see here, is that it often really seems like those who were writing it, who transcribed it, literally transcribed the person's speech as it was spoken, which sort of makes sense if you're going to go through the bother of writing it down in Yiddish. So I guess the point is you want to really convey what the person said and how they said it. So they would do that. And if you actually parse the text of these transcriptions, you can literally, you can notice the verbal tics, you can notice how the people are expressing themselves, and they'll say, so I said to him, da-da-da, and they said to me, da-da-da, and the expressions that the people used, and it's very fascinating. Someone pointed out to me that Zalman Shazar, actually, at one point in his academic career, actually did an article. He had different areas of academic interest. One of his areas of interest was, I guess, Yiddish, and he once did an article, at this point, maybe 80 years ago, where he was malakit, he sort of observed, identified this genre of Yiddish writing, and he made the points that I am making about how valuable and rare and important and unparalleled these sources are for the history of Yiddish. And then he was malakit every single instance in Shalos Tshuvos, but up until a certain date, maybe up until the 1600s, maybe the 1400s to the 1600s, maybe including the 1600s or not including, I'll have to check again, but certainly not into the 1700s. So, because I guess once you get there, then it just keeps on expanding and expanding. So that work was done. Since then, I'm not sure if any additional work has really been done to this effect. I remember seeing some notice in the last 2-3 years, perhaps, about some new academic venture to study this Yiddish in some form. I don't remember what exactly the premise was. I'm not sure if it ended up happening yet. But as I go through Tshuvos, one of the things I look out for are these Gvias Edison, and they tend to come up when you search for dates because they often have dates in them. And when they do, I like to actually go through them and read them just for the value that I find in that as well. And if there's dialogue, if there's actual dialogue, so I'll break it up into the form of dialogue just for myself, for ease of reading, and it's pretty fascinating to me. And often you can notice things about vocabulary, about expressions, if you actually pay attention to this. And it's just a fascinating source for Yiddish, like I said. I will note that the Shalos Tshuvos Tzemach Tzedek also contains a decent number of such Gvias Edus. And in fact, in my list of stuff for Tazayin Sivan, I do have a short entry from the Tzemach Tzedek as well, although I wasn't planning on really getting into it. So if you look at the Gvias Edus here, so it says someone by the name of Wolf. Also, he gets the Kaf apostrophe title, Kmar Wolf ben Kmar so-and-so. Came and he said, and there's always the standard Lashonis, he came, it's B'toidas Edus, B'chedem Chomer, Ba'avoinim lo yagav v'nos avoinoi, so the Beis Din would intimidate them, you have to say the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth. That's the Jewish version of that, I guess you could say. And so this is what this Wolf said, Ich bin hergekommen von Feld, hab gefunden, hängen in Kalb. I found a calf hanging, it had been slaughtered and it was hanging. Hab aber nicht gewusst, als es geschachten is. No, it's possible that there are some typos here, so I don't know if als is the correct word here or not, or my chesaron yediyah, or I'm just not copying something. But the point is, I didn't know if it was geschochten, and you got to see how they use some of these words. So it says geschochten. Also, I thought it wasn't 8 days old yet, so what's up with that? So, okay, the story goes on a bit. Then anderen Tag, zum Mittag, the next day to lunch, hat mir den Reb Aaron sein Freu gebracht and Fleisch. So this Reb Aaron, the person who's being accused of stuff, his wife brought me Fleisch. Hab ich ihr gesagt. So I said to her, that's what I was describing, these types of dialogue. I said to her, het mir eier man lieber gebatkend mein Kalb von gestern? Did your dear husband gebatkend gegimel beis dalad kof nun tough? Did he do the bedika? So was he beidik my calf from yesterday? Because she had brought him meat, I guess, that her husband had shechted, but he's saying, I have this calf, I'm not sure what the story is. If it's good, then I guess I could eat the meat in my own home. So she went home. So this again, he's speaking very conversationally. So she went home, and she told her husband, and he came running, and he said, "Oh, do you still have some of that flesh? I also want to eat from it." Sag ich, I say, meint du das ernst? You mean that seriously? Sagt ja. He says, yeah. Hab ich gesagt, so I said, ich ess doch nichts davon. I'm not eating from that. Then es ist doch nicht gebatkend. It's not checked. Wenn ihr mir chotsche $100 geben tut, even if you give me $100, well, obviously it's the taler, which the dollar is named after. If you give me $100, ess ich nicht davon. I'm not eating from that. Then ich halt es doch für den rechte Treife. I consider it to be totally treif, weil es nicht gebatkend is, because it's not gebatkend. Hat gesagt, okay, how much would you sell me the flesh for? So I said how much I would sell it for. He said, fine, deal. So basically, he just ignored the tinus and said, fine, just sell it to me, I'll buy it, I'll eat it. So that was the edus of this Reb Wolf. So this is considered to be damning edus about this Reb Aaron's conduct and behavior about the meat that he shechted himself and apparently wasn't beidik. Then they found another edus, a bacher, Meir ben Rav Tovia Zal, and apparently they had a similar conversation. The taina was, it's an Isser Gomer. He said, nah, mekach klom, adarabba kasher Gomer, who's here, they're not writing it in Yiddish, but just the teichen of the conversation. That bacher said, also under penalty, under the Einish Hanal, that last winter there was a Yerushalmi, a visitor from Yerushalayim, with a Misharis, a shochet muvik, and they took, after Aaron shechted something, they took after the shkita chalif shaloi, the chalif, and on the chalif there was a pegima, and so they said to him in front of me, you can't shech with this chalif. They said, I make sure not to use that part of the chalif. I don't use the bottom part where the pegima is. I only shech from the top. So that also seemed concerning. And the bacher says, I was in so-and-so's house, and his wife was also there. She also heard, and this was in front of this Aaron Shochet and the Yerushalmi's Misharis when they checked the chalif, and I heard this, so I'm reporting what I heard on that occasion. And they signed the Gvias Edus, Kol Hanal Hug B'Kedas V'Kedin, Poi Bickerberg, Yoim Beis, Tez Zayin Sivan, Tov Kuf Chav Beis. So here's the document from this date, from some Farvorfen Shtetl, this date, Tez Zayin Sivan, Tov Kuf Chav Beis, 1762, and it signed this Shmai Halevi mi Hamburg, Dayan the Kehilas Poizna. So earlier, at the end of the Shaila, he signed his name, Cotton Shmai Halevi Dayan the Kehilas Poizna, Me Hamburg, Umatzla Adosoi, B'Yeshe B'Oil Teira B'Veis Gvir, Rebleib Castle in Bickerberg. So that's 3 different places. I tried looking, not clear if this person was notable enough to have any other biographical information out there on him, or this is really where we know about him from. So somehow he's from Hamburg, the Dayan of Posen, but ended up in Bickerberg. And interestingly, he's also described as sort of living in the home of the Gvir Leib Castle, similar to what we had recently with Wertheimer, this idea of people writing shilas from the home of the local Gvir, the local Talmid Chacham. So in the case of Wertheimer, that was in Wien, that was a bigger city, although I don't know how big the Jewish community was at the time. Here you have a small shtetl, there's also the local Gvir, who, as we'll see, is also, in a second, we'll see, was also signed on the Gvias Eidos, and the Dayan is in his home, so that's also interesting. I also didn't see much about this related castle elsewhere. So the Gvias Eidos is signed, Shmai Levi Hamburg Dayan Posen, Nuk O B'Yehuda Leib Ben Yosef Levi Zatzal Mikasel, and Avraham ben Mordechai Englander Peches, which presumably stands for Parnas Chodesh. So that itself is interesting, how in a small shtetl they didn't have a beis din per se, but it seems like they had this tradition of you have to have a beis din. So who's going to be the beis din? The three most chashuva people. So it's the imported dayan, who it's unclear how long he lived there and if it was a permanent thing or not, and the gvir and the Parnas Chodesh. So they are the ad hoc beis din at least. So that's with regard to the issue of shchita. However, in the Shaila, this Shmaya Taina, there was also issues that this Reb Aaron also was writing the stam, the safros for the community, and he was writing the ksubas for the community, and everything was problematic. So the next Gvias Eidos starts over, Moisav Tlasa, there was another sitting, and Avram Reb Shimon came. And he was reporting that after this Reb Shmaya Sagal, who was the very same person signed on all this stuff, says when Reb Shmaya Sagal hat in the drasha eingesetzt from tefillin wagon, so he had been ma'er about the tefillin. Basically, he was already making a shtorim that whoever has tefillin written by the Aaron should bring it in for inspection. And he also stirred about the ksubas. So a certain almana came, and she said the Rebbe Leb, which itself is interesting. We know in the Polish Welt today, in Manifesto, they say Tata Leben, or there's the song, the Rebbe's a Leben, a Mazel Tov, which sort of translates to Sheyichya, and it's possible that the Sheyichya in Hebrew is actually more of a translation from Leben. It would be interesting to see which way it went. Obviously in Chabad you also have Zol Gesundsein, which is related, the same genre. So here it says, Reb Leb, like Reish apostrophe Leb. So it probably pronounced Reb Leb. Here are my son's tefillin. So Shmaya said, I can't even open it. It doesn't have gittin. Apparently it's not even sewn correctly. And then after some back and forth, Shmaya picked up the tefillin and he said, there's an puzzle, there's no situs, I don't want to open it, let someone else open it. So someone else opened it, and then they gave the parsha to the Shmaya. He looked at it, he said, Oi, there's an puzzle, it's missing the word who, bring a chumash, and Zakt Rabbi Seleb, Zet Yed Allah, here, with the Rosh Aaron in front of us, you shouldn't be able to deny it. Also, there's no sirtut. Then they brought a ksuba, and he said, Oy lanu ki chatanu, di is oich pasel, zet rabbi seleb. Oh, so the ksuba is no good. Then he said, but I can't take money. It's a poor person. I guess generally you would expect to charge for a ksuba, but I can't take. So I'm going to write you another ksuba. I want to write it for free. But tonight, when irvot l'toiva, in bris mila machin, muster mir das moil shaft gabim. So not all the details here are even relevant to the story, but you could see it's literally writing the conversation, describing the scene as it happened. So this is precious, rare, real dialogue that you're not going to find anywhere else from this era. And that's why I made a point of reading some of it, just to demonstrate why it's cute to read, it's cute to see, and valuable, of course, as well. And then there's a few more short paragraphs about other people brought tefillin, and they also didn't have situs, and we also couldn't open them because they didn't have gittin. Or maybe it's fakert. Maybe they didn't have gittin. The supply for safras wasn't a pasha dezach. So maybe the vart is that they didn't have gittin to resew it afterwards. Maybe that's the vart. That's what it sounds like here. So that's why they weren't in the previous case. He didn't want to open it because then he can't close it. And so in that the part of the dialogue that I skipped, someone said, "Okay, we have another pair of tefillin here from a mess. If we open this one, you could take that one, so you won't be stuck without tefillin." So. Also gives you some color, some picture of life in the small German shtetl. And so this had taken place a few days later. This is signed in Bickelberg, Yom Aleph B'cha, the Chav Beis, Sivan Tavka Chav Beis, and signed Shmaya Levi Hamburger, Dayan, and Yudah Leib of Kassel, and the Dayan Hashlishi, who's not with us, etc., etc. So if you look back to the Shaila, so the Shail, Shmaya is asking the back of Emden, so what's the story? Do you have to treif everything up? Do you have to kasher kalim? What about the klicheres? So asking some really serious questions here, and he had some other examples of other inyanim and shchita that the person did that were incorrect, weren't mentioned in the Gviyas Eidos. So that was his shaila. And then in the follow-up to his shaila before the Gviyas Eidos, he also mentions that the more we've looked into it, now I'm convinced that he is from the Apokars, the Poikin, and the Mavazim Divri Chazal Kat Shatz Yimach Shmoy. So part of the hunting for Shabbat Tzvinikus. That perhaps was really spurred by Yaakov Emden. So the person writing to him is inspired by Yaakov Emden. He's also trying to dig up the kat shots, and now he's accusing this guy. That's probably the pshat of what he's doing. And here's where he mentions about he was Masada Kedushin before I came here, right? So like we said before, until now he was the Reverend. So who's Masada Kedushin? The Reverend. And now the Dayan came and sort of sidelined him, and now he's uncovering all of this misbehavior. When I read the Ksubis, which is alluded to in the Gvias Eidos, but here he says, I read them and I was shocked. There were Yuds missing and Vavs missing and some complete letters were missing. So now what's the story with them? Is it we might see laws on their children? Is there something wrong with their children? They were born from marriage without a ksuba? So what do we do now? Do I need to write a ksuba de irkasa for them or what? Not only that, he also, there was a woman who needed chalitza, but he was just Masadr Kedushin with someone, and he knew she needed Yibum, so that's pretty egregious. And he was Masadr Aget Beinoyle Bein Atzma, which sounds like he was Masadr Aget for himself. And he's writing Kameas, so that's for sure going to get Rabbi Emden's attention. And so he's just an all-around terrible guy. So like I said, there's part 1 of the Shaila, part 2 of the Shaila, with all these additional tainas, and the Gvias Eidos, both from Tezayin Sivan, which focuses more on the Shchita, and from Chav Beis Sivan, which focuses on some of the additional tainas as well. So perhaps the Shaila also is sort of divided between Tezayin and Chav Beis, although the date on top of the Shaila was Chav Gimel. So like I said, in this case, the Shaila is somewhat more interesting than the answer, but the Rabbi Emden responded, Reish Chodesh Tammuz, Tafkal Chav Beis, 2, HaTeironi, HaDayan, Reb Shmaya, not too many other titles, so maybe Taka wasn't machshav him too much, like more of a Pashat Ben Teira. So I got your letter, and when I got your letter, there was a Muhumma, because there's a Muhammad these days right nearby, and everyone's running around trying to conceal their possessions, and we're not sure where we're going to run. If you look it up, 1762 is the 7 Years' War, there was stuff going on. So I saw your tainas, so really we have to break them down into what exactly all the accusations are and to categorize them. So he says, you're describing him like he was machal, trefas and avelis, so you definitely have proven that there's kalos on the side on behalf of the shochet, but if that's all you've got, then we're not going to ask for the shchita, and we're certainly not going to treif up all the kalim, so you're going a bit too far with this. But if you, as a beis din, see that he's a cow, so then you could penalize him and be mavre him, hakor lefir oisa beis din, based on whatever umdana. But you certainly shouldn't be mafsid and make people have to lose the meat and the kalim. It didn't rise to that level. You have to see the tshuva for more details. We're not going to get into the detail. On the other issues, so some of them seem serious, but let's say the ksubas. You said you don't want to be mitzi laws on the children. Like, what do you mean mitzi laws on the children? That they're mamzedim? Because the ksubas are missing letters. And he throws in a line, and if there is an issue of mamzerus with ksubas, because statistically, how many ksubas do you think are 100% perfect? We know, and I'm speaking myself, in the last 50, 75 years, we know there's a whole genre of the ksuba checkers, and it's very easy to find something wrong. So you're also jumping way out of proportion here in terms of what the problem, the concern, the ramifications are. You can go see what's going on in the big Kehilas. Don't think that what you found. You're looking under a magnifying glass at this guy. That's not so serious. But if you say that he was Masad Kedushin for someone who needed Yibum Chalitza, that's obviously very serious. So then he's an Avarya, and then he's a Machti Luzulasa, and he's a apostle, and he has no nemanis for anything anymore. And if you say he was Mesader his own get, so that's also very serious, because it's also Chash Mamzerus, Kol Mishin Yedei, but Tivgitten V'Kiddushin, Al Yehle Eisakim Mohem, so you have to check that. And if you say that he was Machshir people with Tefillin, so that's also very serious, and that proves that he's a Kal Katzvi. So alluding to the Shabbat Tzvi allegations. So you're saying he's a Kal, but he's a Kal Katzvi. And you say he's writing Kameas. So nowadays, anyone who writes Kameas is Itra Luches Kasayu. They're usually it's usually bad news. The Ha'iskim Bahem, I think it's Vadi Itra Luches Kasayu, the Ha'iskim Bahem. Was Stoman Inyan Rahu Mikol Tzad. Chazak is, these guys are up to no good. So again, Beis Din should look into it. If he's Mekel Reish, and Ebazoi, Pasal his shchita, but only mikan v'hala. So that's very simple. So Rav Emden both said that he was very harried by the war activity at the time, and but like I said, in this shuv you don't see so much of his personality on display, and he's actually sort of putting this junior dayan in place that you have to know what the exact darim are. It seems like this dayan was really going to town on this sheikhet v'shatz, but you still have to know that you can't, you don't go further than is necessary in terms of asering and paskening. So that's the first shuvah. Of course, we've gone longer than I was expecting to. So the next one is from Tafkuf Mem Tes, not that long afterwards, about 27 years. And this is from the Noda B'yehuda from Prague, and he's writing to the Beis Din of Trich, which is in Moravia. And they had a shaila. The shaila was, I'll try to keep it more bekitzer now. The shaila was, there was an atzidas geshamim, it was a tzara, there was no rain. So they wanted to know about this idea of going to the Beis HaKvaros to ask for rachmim and to bring a Sefer Torah along. And the community was divided. Some said, yeah, you're supposed to take a Sefer Torah to the Beis HaKvaros and Eis Tzara. And the raya is, it says in Zohar Achrei, that's Ma'ir, the souls of the Mesim. And then they go and tell those buried in Chevron, the office, and then they are Ma'ir Rachmim. So it's a Zohar, that's what you do. And then there are others who say, no, Alpi Gemara Paiskim, you're not supposed to take a Sefer Torah into the Beis HaKvaros. What are you talking about? That was the shaila. Now this is very interesting because those who are familiar with the Noda B'yehuda, especially based on the recent scholarship of Ma'os Kahana, who wrote a whole book on the Noda B'yehuda versus the Chasam Sofer. So we know that the Noda B'yehuda had a very interesting mahalach in which it seems he was seeking to purify halacha, psak halacha, from outside influence, non-Gemara Peskim influences. So that could be, for example, Sefer Chassidim, Tzvas B'Yehuda Chassid, sources like that, but especially the Zohar. And Ma'os Kahana proves this and demonstrates this as a very strong ongoing theme throughout the Noda B'yehuda's writing. So this is another such example. So the Noda B'yehuda wrote back to them, the fact that you think Al Pi Zohar it's pasha that you should, and Al Pi Gemara it's pasha that you shouldn't, you should know both sides are wrong. Both sides of the argument got their arguments wrong. First of all, Al Pi Gemara it's mashma only to go with an open Sefer Torah. But with a closed Sefer Torah, so he brings the Rambam Tur, but his takeaway generally is that Lavdaf gets a problem, it's a loig l'rash, to mocking the dead, if you bring a Sefer Torah. So from the Talmud and the Paiskim, he summarizes, Ein shum tzad mefeirish, le'yisr v'le'yaheter, although from the Rambam it's mashba, you shouldn't. So, but from the Gemara, it's not exactly as clear-cut as you say that you shouldn't. And the other side that said, Al Pi Zohar, you should, like MS, and there he throws in a very typical disclaimer of MS. Shani ainli asik ben status. I don't handle in these hidden things. Halavai I can be yaitz what I need to do with the regular Gemara paiskim. That's what we need to be yaitzikim. But if you're already quoting the Zohar, so let's discuss the Zohar. Now, interestingly, I looked it up in Ma'os Kahana's book. Ma'os Kahana says that the Noda B'yehuda, ever since the first shuvah, whatever the first one, where he sort of went out with this declaration that he wants to avoid the Zohar, so did he actually always avoid paskening from the Zohar? Ma'os Kahana, yes. And the footnote, he says, the only exception is this shuvah Noda B'yehuda, which also proves the point, because obviously his point is ultimately not to listen to the Zohar. But the fact that he even goes on now to say that if you read the Zohar says kach v'kach, that itself is a chiddush from Noda B'yehuda, because usually Noda B'yehuda avoids doing even that. So that's pretty interesting. So this is what he says. If you look in the Zohar says, so what's this? The Zohar is an achrei. And there's a whole arichas there, taka, like the shoyalim summarized, it says that you bring the Sefer Torah to the Beis HaKvaros, and it's ma'ir. But there's a story there that Yehuda said that once Reb Chizki and Reb Yisrael were on the road, and they were in Gush Chalav, and there was Charav over there, and they sat next to Beis HaKvaros, and he had Rabbi Yisrael part of a Sefer Torah, and all of a sudden one of the Kvarim was screaming to them, oh, what's going on? Is the world in trouble? There's a Torah here? Or are you making fun of us? Is that why you're here with the Torah? So what's the story? So the person said, I'm a mess, and you got me going with the Sefer Torah. I woke up, and the way it works is that there was once, the world was once Bitzar, and the living came here with a Sefer Torah. So I, Mechavedim, we were awakened, and we ran to Chevron, to the Mesei Chevron, and then when they connected with, in Gan Eden, with the Ruchas of the Tzaddikim, it turned out that the Sefer Torah they brought, that the living people brought, was Pasel. So they're being Meshaker in the name of the king, because there was an extra Vav in the Pasuk, B'Shesas, Shesa, Shtei Process, which I believe is in your A. So they said, oh, you're Meshaker B'Shma de Malka, so we got punished. Like, we got punished for, we just were doing the thing where the Sefer Torah comes, we go running. And now it turns out we're in trouble, and we got kicked out of the Bey Mesifta, of the yeshiva. And the story goes on in that vein. I and Shom don't have time to go into parichas, but that's the teichen of the Zohar there. So the Noda B'yehuda seizes on that and says, "Oh, you saw the Zohar. You're quoting half the Zohar that says that you should bring it to be Moreh the Mason. But what does it say in the Zohar? The Zohar says that if Chas v'Shalom the Torah is missing even one ice, it causes a tremendous raw. So Bazai, who here has a Sefer Torah that's checked for Chaseris v'Yaseris, and he's mitzayin to a Ramah, which we'll get to. So in that Zohar it says, it just had an extra vav in the pasuk of B'Shisah Shes, a shtei process, and that itself is kamat goyim a big churban. So al pi the Zohar, Chalil al-Asis came. So here's the one place where the Noda B'yehuda uses the Zohar back against them to say, you shouldn't do what the Zohar says to do, you should do what the Zohar says not to do. And you can be married b'tfilas, bakashas, and cry, and Rachman ali b'boy, the ikr is the heart, Hashem will help. That was the tshuva of the Noda B'yehuda. Number of Achreinim who wrote artists on the Noda B'yehuda point out that no one's mentioning that there's a Ran in Tainus that talks about this minute, whether you take the Sefer Torah out to the basic forest or not, and he said not to, the way committing Makaimus, that they bring the art in the basic forest. So there is earlier context from the Tkuf of the Ran presenting both sides of this minig. So if the Noda B'yehuda is into pasken, so he should have quoted from the pasken. Maybe Taka overlooked it at the time. And the Achron pointing this out, the Cheshik Salim says, if you look in the Ran there, so it's already printed in the Gemara with the Chedushi Anshi Shem. The Chedushi Anshi Shem says, look in the Zohar, in Achre, and elsewhere. Like the Ran's Maskana was not to, and the Zohar is quoted as saying that you should. That's usually how the Zohar is quoted. That's how they quoted it to the Noda B'yehuda, and the Noda B'yehuda himself flipped the Zohar around. The Reis of Sharon Ottenson, his Haggah points out that it's not just the Ran, it's brought in the Beis Yosef, in Eira Chaim Siman Kuf Samach Tes, and it says from the Gemara it's also mashma took out the Sefer Torah, and so there was there was discussion on Paiskin about this, and yet somehow it didn't make it into the Shaila and the Tshuva here, which is interesting in its own right. Interestingly, I saw that last year the Biala Rebbe passed away, and when he passed away, they pointed out that he used to give a lot of shiurim and Yonei Halacha, lots of svarim. So I saw that he has a sefer shiurim of Asher Tov and Brachas Chilek Gimel. He has a whole shtickle there on taking the Sefer Torah to B'Sakvaris, and starts by quoting the Noda B'yehuda, Ba'arichas, the whole Arichas there. So I noticed that he points out that the Noda B'yehuda said that who has a Sefer Torah that's Badek B'Chaseris v'Yaseris. So he took that to mean that the Noda B'yehuda is saying that it's what Chazal say. Chazal make a general blanket statement that Ein Onu B'Kiyin B'Chaseris v'Yaseris. So we don't know the true spelling of the Sefer Torah, which raises questions about the whole Geder of our Sefer Torah. The Shagas Ayataka says that it's a Shaila in the Sefer Torah B'Chalal. So the Biala Rebbe quotes Chasam Sofer. Chasam Sofer says, Lamaisa, as long as you stick to the Messiah, we could treat it like a kosher Torah. We don't assume that our Torahs are not kosher. So the Biala Rebbe was saying, so the Chayra, that's an answer to Noda B'yehuda. If you go with the Mahalach of Chasam Sofer, maybe not like the Shagas Ayah, so then the Torah is written up Messiah, so what should be the problem? But I don't think that's the Kavanah, that's the Pshat in the Noda B'yehuda. The Noda B'yehuda didn't say, Ein Onu B'Kiyim. He said, Eifoi, Kain Eifoi, Ayetzleinu Sefer Torah, Shi Baduk B'Chaseris v'Yaseris. I think he means that Stam Sefer Torah in your shul is not written Kafid Messiah that we follow. I mean, there's always going to be mistakes, and he's mitzayin to the Ramah. The Ramah is in Kufnam Gimel, Sif Dal, Hilchos Kriyas Torah. The Ramah says there, you have a mistake, you take another Torah, Mov Kriya. It says, Hadam Mitzina Cheres, Davka Shinim to Torah's Garment. Davka if you find a terrible mistake, a full, total mistake. Al Mishim Chaseris v'Yaseris, Ein Lo Yitzia Cheres. But if it's just a missing or extra letter, don't take it another one. She'en Sifrei HaTorah Shalom Meduyakim Kol Kach, Sheneimar, She'acheres Yeser Kasher. Our Sifrei Torah aren't so great that why would you assume that the next one is going to be any better? And he's been signed to earlier Ashkenazi Mekaydes. So, but Pashtus, from that context, it seems pretty clear that the Kavanah is Pashut, that they knew chances were, anytime they checked the Torah, they always found mistakes. The Torahs were just not up to the level of accuracy. So I think that's what the Noda B'yehuda means. Not that Sifrei Torah, the Messiah from the Balei Messiah isn't accurate, but that the Sifrei Torah aren't good. So I guess to that, the Biala Rebbe could still respond and say that today maybe we're a little bit more confident the way we check the Sefer Torah now with computers. Maybe we're more confident that Stama Sefer Torah, we wouldn't hopefully Chas v'Shalom think that every Sefer Torah has Chaseris v'Yaseris. So that could still be a response if you want to argue with the Noda B'yehuda on that point. But it's just important to clarify the pshat and the kavanah of the Noda B'yehuda here, which I believe is as I explained. Now, of course, this is a much larger topic, the Jewish attitude to cemeteries and to Kibbutz Tzadikim, and the developments in the Menhagim, different times, different places, and the Biala Rebbe himself gets into that a bit over there, but it's beyond the scope of our discussion here. The next tshuva is from Tov Kuf Tzadik Tes. So that's already, we were in the 1800s already, the end of the Tov Kufs, but the beginning of the 1800s. This is 1839. And this is the Chasam Sofer, who, like most Kahana, often sort of bundles them together. It's like the Noda B'yehuda and the Chasam Sofer are something of a pairing, although the Chasam Sofer is the next door. But the Chasam Sofer was to some degree in the shadow of the Noda B'yehuda, often responding to things the Noda B'yehuda said, either agreeing or disagreeing. But this is a big one. The Noda B'yehuda is talking about head coverings for women, which is always very relevant, very negaya. And the Chasam Sofer lays out his very stringent view. And he's miyasid that in his Havana, it says, based on the Makaitis, we don't have time to go through gruntig over here, or gruntlich, depending on how you say it, but basically his mahalach is that a woman's not allowed to uncover her hair, even in her own room. That's mamish, not okay. Minimum, she has to have kalosa, kuf lamed safei, that's the first covering. That is only up until her chotzer. But once she leaves the chotzer, she also has to put another hat on top of kalasa, of this first covering. That's his takeaway from that whole sugya. And he says it could be this machlekes, this, that, here. But so, and he connects it to the Gemara's discussion of Das Moshe versus Das Yehudis. Das Moshe is mamish halacha. Das Yehudis is like an extra level of like, this is what we do because we're Yidden. If you don't do this, then bisnish ken Yid. A little bit similar to a lot of the conventions we have today that you could describe perhaps as being in the category of Das Yehudis. So the first covering, that's Das Moshe. And the second covering, that's Das Yehudis. So if a woman goes out without the second covering, she's being over on Das Yehudis. There's a machlekes about the exact parameters, but this is what we follow. So now it's ready like a din. Once we accept this day upon ourselves, it's a din. So his maskan is hayetzi lalachas b'makim sharabim mitzuyim. So with a mitpachas, b'li koiva, with just the term he uses for the first covering for kalasa, he turns it into mitpachas. So if she just wears a tichel without a hat on top, that's a veris Das Yehudis. You have the Das Moshe, the hair is covered, but you don't have the Das Yehudis, and she's, it's a veris Das Yehudis is very serious. She is divorced, not a ksuba. And even in the Chotzer, for Kiblu Alaya Avesa Vesin B'chamakim Sheshamanu Shnafritzi Yisrael, we go even further, and we apply this standard even to the Chotzer. And he makes it sound like everyone, everywhere, always was makabel this. It's always interesting. Chasam Sofer often makes these blanket statements of everyone, everywhere that we know does this. So even being over on that is Yitzis Blake Suba, because that's already minig. This minig is also Das Yadus. And then he gets into this famous tshuva of Maram Alashker about the hair that sticks out by the ears, sort of an infamous tshuva. And Maram Alashker was somewhat lenient about how it depends what people cover in that particular land. In Eretz Edom versus Eretz Yishmael, he says in Eretz Yishmael they didn't cover it. In Eretz Edom, in the European lands, even in his time, they used to cover it. But even that, that it's a minig Yisrael, v'chumra nagu kain, could be because the goyim also don't uncover those. So it's not a real chumra, it's not a real minig. So Maram Alashker took a more lenient view to that here. And the Chasam Sofer isn't willing to accept even that. He says, in our lands, the women, the men, the umais, the women, they uncover their heads b'chlal, and our ancestors, our mothers, imoisenu, loyatsu, v'nizru ma'oid, and they're makbid on the Zohar. The Zohar says not to reveal a single hair. So even though if it was purely halacha, then we would probably just go with the Gemara. According to the Gemara, it could be that hair is fine. Halacha is not like the Zohar, but mikol makim, so then we have a rule, he quotes an Ashkenazi source, that minig oiker halacha v'nasa halacha gavur. That's the power of minig, that if everyone is makbid in a certain way, so even if the halacha says that it's okay, but the minig says that it's not okay, so the minig takes the binding nature of halacha. So here you also see the Chasam Sofer's attitude to Zohar, connects to the previous tshuva from the Noda B'yehuda. But here, the Chasam Sofer is a lot more comfortable with saying, look, you want to say it's not the original pure halacha, fine, but now it's the minig kehazayar, and that itself is powerful enough. So haklal hayotze kol shum seir b'shum makim barosh padachas b'nesua, any here, anywhere, even in her room, anywhere on her head, and anywhere where she is, even inside her own room, it's an erva. She has to have a mitpachas in her room, and if she goes out into a chotzer shel rabim, even she needs a koiva as well. And with regard to that little bit of hair, so technically, maybe in the Artzos Yishmael, it's still not an Ereva, but in our lands, the minig is al pi Zohar, it's Eikad Halacha, so it's also an Isser Gomer, and you have to be choishish for the whatever the Zohar says, the terrible things the Zohar says. Misha Chavetz Bevracha, Yarchik Mimenu, and this is a sign, Tez Zayin Sivan, Tov Kuf Tzadik Tes, in Preshburg, Ramesha Sofer. And it's famous, they quote the Tzavav, the Chasam Sofer, who wrote to his descendants, the women, that they should not reveal even one hair from their heads. And he also asked her the sheitel, which is its own whole topic, and maybe I just mentioned recently that I believe I did. Well, now I'm not sure if it was something that was shared publicly or just maybe a private message to someone. At any rate, at that time in Ashkenaz and across the Ashkenazi lands in Poland, sheitel was considered aser. The earlier makaidos for sheitel were more from Italy, and that's its own whole halachic story. But this dafka explains that today, much of the Polish Hungarian world, they do wear some kind of hair-based covering, sheitel. However, whoever has seen the Chassidish women will see that most of them, certainly the more Hungarian you get, are makbid to have whether a full hat on top of it, some suffice with something less than a hat. But this is the context. This is where it's coming from. And apparently, even in Yerushalayim, where the real Yerushalayimers that I believe still never changed, were not mishana the lavush at all. The women do not have sheitlach. They apparently are also makbid, the real ones are also makbid, that there's a mitpachas and some kind of kaiva on top of the mitpachas. I'm not baki ad kadekach, haven't analyzed it, but this Chasam Sofer is a very central source for this whole discourse and impacts and affects how a big percentage of Haredi women look till this day because of his interpretation. Now, the Chasam Sofer is making a leap there when he said that the first covering, kalasa, that she has to wear for Das Moshe, he said it's a mitpachas, so others point out that there's room to say that the kalasa wasn't a full covering, it was like a hairnet or something. So that's why, das Moshe is you have to wear a hairnet, and das Yehudis is that it should be a full covering. So l'chayra, even if you have one covering, but it's a full covering, l'chayra, that's good. You don't need to have two coverings. That's what other achreinim would say. And I saw that one of the Rabbanim from the Brandstorfer family wrote about it recently. And is it a chiyuv to have two lefi the derech of the Chasam Sofer and minig Yerushalayim or not? And he's sort of acknowledging that based on these other achroinim's interpretation, it's hard to say that it's mamash a chiyuv, but this is what people do. So he ultimately leans towards continuing to do the minig. This also connects to the whole minig of shaving the head, which is now I'm remembering this is the context in which I mentioned sheitel recently to somebody. I was discussing the minig of shaving the head, which is also a factor here. Its own whole discussion, can't get into that now. Of course, the Igros Moshe Feinstein was much more makel. He was essentially makel for women in America to not cover their heads at all inside their house. And he actually goes through in Even HaEzer, Chelik Aleph, Simnun Ches, I don't remember now which krach of the set it is, but he goes through and he quotes the Chasam Sofer, and he, Lefi Darkoi, sort of takes the Chasam Sofer apart and says, Shitas Chasam Sofer is Tumua. So, Ledina, Minoroi, Shiachmidu Hanashim, like the Chasam Sofer, because Hayol V'yatzam Upumei, the Goyin Gadol Kemoisai. But Pasha, that if you want to be Mekel, you can't be Machsha them as Oivlis Hadas Yehudas Chas V'Shalom, and even a Talmud Chacham Yidei Shemayim could marry a woman if she's Yidei Shemayim, Dakdakas V'mitzvahs Balas Midas. Look there to see all the details of what he's discussing, different pratim here. But Azoi gedenkt sich, Bechlal, I think Yedua, that Ramesha Taka was Mekel, was Mater, if women want to not cover their head, to grow out some hair and to not cover their head completely at home, that was fine with Ramesha. So definitely an odd Chasam Sofer. And I think this case is certainly a case where if you want to take the Chasam Sofer's words on their merits, there's a lot to dingzich with, both in Pshat, like we said, in Kalasa, and also in deciding what minig is binding and how widespread the minig was, and what happens if a big chunk of Klal Yisrael, maybe their Babbas had the minig and now they don't have the minig anymore. So there's a lot to dingzich with, and even the Hungarian world, like we've said, they're not keeping exactly what the Chasam Sofer said. He said no sheitlach, and sheitlach is very much in the picture for a large number of people. Taka, I think in some parts of Satmar, maybe the Rebbitzins, they Taka don't wear sheitlach. I think they're more makbid Taka to stick to mamish, the traditional headgear. But certainly it's not considered usher, even for a community that's known for all its chumras. It's not completely banned. Obviously, there are a lot of restrictions compared to other communities, but so it's always tricky once you're starting to appeal to the power of minig and that this is what we do and this is the only way we do it. So that's when things start getting fuzzy. So it ends up being more based on the authority of the Chasam Sofer. Obviously, the Hungarian world, Mamish considers the Chasam Sofer's Hira as binding in many ways. The rest of the world obviously also is machshir the Chasam Sofer. Even the Igros Moshe had to say, "Hoyel b'yatz mipumei the goyin gadol k'maisai." I've recently, Bechlal, been looking into the fact that I think even in Chabad, there's a sort of yachas to him as almost like a Rashka Bahag, which is rare for someone from such a late point in time. Chasam Sofer really is in his own category, but like someone like the Rav Moshe, who still had that independence and was willing to still follow his own mahalach, his own view, his own opinion, so was willing to say, hey, that's not... I don't agree on necessarily on the halacha or on the minig or what you're saying, that this is a gedr of das Yehudis. So that's how I would summarize that dynamic there. The next one is Tafresh Tez Zayin, just a short thing. I mentioned it, I alluded to it before. The Tzemach Tzedek, Even HaEzer Siman Pei, has a whole Gvias Edus about Nebuch, someone who was burned to death, and quoting from all kinds of people who spoke to all kinds of Goyim, and quoting what the Goyim said in Russian, which itself is even maybe more interesting. Stuff in Yiddish, stuff in Russian. Not going to actually get into it, just going to mention it. Another one. Next one, Tafresh Nun Vav, Hari B'Samim, Reb Aya Leibish Horowitz, Rav of Galicia, talks about a situation where someone married a woman and then they realize that she has a mark that looks like it could be Michaili Shkrapel or Skrapel. And it's contagious, so he couldn't live with her, and then that created a whole... He took the nadin, then he ran away, and then it was like countersuits. He's saying that she has to let him divorce her because he can't live with her, and they were being tevei him, so he was Messiah to them, and they were Messiah to him. All parsha. Okay, we're not going to get into the pratim, but what's skrapel? So a skrapel is, I saw it's cited in a lot of svarim, but I didn't see a single sefer actually identify what it is. But apparently in English it's scrofula, which was related to tuberculosis. And taka is something serious. Apparently, you see it's mentioned a lot in the 1800s. It was unfortunately fairly common at the time, and it's what comes up in different such shilas. That's from Tafresh Nun Vav. It's already the 1890s. Two shilas, two tshuvas from Rav Kook. One from Tafresh Peit Tes. That's already the 1900s, 1929. Tazayin Sivan, a response to Argentina. They had a shaila in Argentina about when they should be masker geshamim, shelas geshamim. Famous question about those in the southern hemisphere, I believe is the premise here. And of course, he basically says you have to stick to the convention, which is you stick to Yisrael, Bavel. We don't invert things for the southern hemisphere. Another tshuva of his from Tafresh Tzadik, that was from Erech Mishpat. This one is from Das Koyen, from Tafresh Tzadik Dalad, to Reb David Miller. David Miller is a very famous character who wrote a very interesting book. He was promoting mikvaos. The people were abandoning Tvila b'mikveh for women. So his idea was that if you can use the water that runs through the pipes, then he had a handbook on how to build a homemade mikveh. You have to build a box and do it like this, and azay, and then fill it up with the tap water, and you're good to go. This was his big campaign. Very fascinating parsha. I've looked into it before. So interesting to see it pop up where he sent his English sefer to Rav Kook. Rav Kook says, I got your sefer in English. I got your English letter. I couldn't respond right away. Now I'm looking at, I went through the sefer. Interestingly, I guess I didn't go double check, but I guess Rav Kook felt comfortable enough to read English. Certainly, I guess, living under the British mandate. So Taka went through the sefer, and Taka, it's very nice, but to say the pashtus that you could use tap water, it so totally depends on what the system locally is. Of course, this is a huge halachic issue. Obviously, today it's not really come out a thing, although there is, I think, some website out there that's still trying to promote this mahalach, but it's considered, obviously, the very fringes of halachic practice. So Rav Kook is saying, it sort of depends on how the water system works. Plus, there are those who say that encouraging this can lead to a pirza, because usually there's peer pressure. If you're somewhat frum, then there's peer pressure. Your friend's going to find out you don't go to the mikveh. It's going to be embarrassing. But if everyone says, I have one at home, so then where's the pressure? So not so pashut. Eini masniach chalila. You mean well. You're out to do good, and could be that it could work. But even then, you should probably write that. You should attach like a letter to your book and say that you should get a Talmud Chacham to supervise it, to make sure there's no psul she'iva, and all the other Darkei Psol, and should be Dovim Kabatuma, and Bechlal, it shouldn't just be up to individuals to decide to do this. The Rabbanim in every region should agree whether they should discuss whether they agree with this idea. And if you add that, so then everyone can accept what you're out to say. So that's interesting to see Rav Kook's response to this. David Miller. If you search David Miller, and his sefer was called Netzach Yisrael, there's definitely a lot more information out there on it. So that is interesting. Another tshuva from Tafshin Daled, that's already 1944. This is in Morocco. So this is in the sefer Mayim Chaim of, I think, Yosef Meshash, Yosef Mesas. And he describes an interesting machlekes, interesting din Torah. There was a tzaddik in Morocco, Rebbe Fal and Kaveh, and he lived in Sali. And he passed away, and his kever became a tzion. Everyone was coming to the tzion. So he had a son, Rebbe Chol Yisachar and Kaveh, who also was a Rav. You can look them both up. So he had been running the kever, the tzion, and he even got a relative there to collect money from the people who came. And all of a sudden, the Shiva Tuviyir, the leaders of the community who had real power, as it describes later, under the Arab rule and under the French rule, so they came and said, hey, actually, we run the show here. We run the basic varas, we run the tzion, you're not the boss, we're the boss. So they had a big fight, and it came before him, before of Masas, and they mentioned in the machlekes, they said, this is not the first such machlekes. We just had a similar machlekes in Casablanca. There, it's the kever of Rav Chaim Pinto. Look it up, it's Rav Chaim Pinto Hasheni, the anicle of the first Rav Chaim Pinto, and he had passed away. Both of these, Ankaveh and Rav Pinto, had both passed away in like the 1930s, like 10 years earlier. And both had been the great Rabbanim and Tzadikim, and their Kvarim became big Kvarim. So similar machlekes happened in Casablanca between someone there and the Zion Tuvia here. And the Zion Tuvia won in that case, so they were saying we should probably win in this case. And Rav Masas said, the call are right, they're certainly in charge, the Basic Varis is always under their jurisdiction. You convinced yourself that you're in charge, it's not true. V'chulu v'chulu, that's more or less bekitzer, but it's interesting to see how these types of disputes were happening. They do feel sort of like modern disputes, but interesting, today in Eretz Yisrael, certainly there could be fights over control to a kever. We've heard recently in Europe, and one of the big kvarim of tzaddikim that's very popular, that is fights over who controls it, like the economy, the industry around the kever. So it's interesting to see that in 1944 there were two such disputes in Morocco over these kvarim. And the psak is from Thursday, Yud Zayin, well, that's Yud Zayin Sivan, but I think earlier it mentions Tez Zayin Sivan as well, or else we wouldn't have mentioned it. Yeah, it says that the din Torah, the hearing was Yom Dalet to Zayin Sivan, and I guess they went through the topic pretty quickly, and the psak was the next day, Thursday, Yud Zayin Sivan. Fast forwarding a bit more, if you look at the Tzitz Eliezer, Chelek Chofsim Yud Dalet, there's a tshuva from Tez Zayin Sivan, Tavshinun Beis. It's already 1992, about sunglasses or glasses where the lens changes color or turns into sunglasses outside. I'm sure there's a technical term that I'm momentarily forgetting, but when you step outside, they turn into sunglasses. When you return inside, they return to a normal color. Is this a Shaila and Shabbos? And he says, Bekitzer, that it's not. And he says, then I saw that Ramesha was also asked about something similar, and he also said it's not a problem. It's not Seva, it's not Mitakin Keli, it's not a problem. And then in conclusion, so that gets us to 1992. And then in conclusion, we have two tshuvas from the Mishnah Halachas, Rav Menashe Klein. Now technically, these are dated Tafshin Lamed Tes. But in my mind, Rav Menashe Klein, I've mentioned before, I grew up near his show, I saw him around a lot. So in my mind, he's a door later than Rav Moshe and the Tzitz Eliezer, even though he was already active. His activity overlapped with theirs. So putting it at the end though, two tshuvas from Tafshin Lamed Tes. One is in Chelek Tes, Siman Reish Yud Ches, Tezayin Sivan Tafshin Lamed Tes. I think both of these are actually to the same person, which is interesting. And one of them, he apologizes if he didn't get his titles correct. Okay, so I guess the second one is really the first one, and it was two shilas and two answers, and then in the Sefer they split them into two, and put one earlier and one later. So the one that's earlier in the Sefer, Siman Reish Yud Ches, which is probably the second half of the tshuva to this person, is the shayla whether doctors can tell a terminal patient that they have no hope and they have X amount of time to live. And Rav Menashe Klein says, I've said this many times, it's absolutely not okay, you're not allowed to do this, al pi Torah. Because first of all, the halal person needs the ikr is the matzav ruach. If you tell someone that they're going to die, that depresses them. He starts bringing rayas from Torah. The classic story is Chizkiah was sick, and Yeshaya comes to him, and Yeshaya told him, "Takek for nigzrolach gzeira, it's finished, it's terminal." And Chizkiah, the Gemara says, Chizkiah said, "Stop with your nevuah and get out of here. I'm told, we learned at home, so it's kind of the same. It's just not a doctor; it's a navi. But the navi is saying, "Yeah, it's finished," and Chizkiah is saying, "Excuse me, that's not something that's okay to say." And it's medayik also from the halacha in Yeridei Siman Shalom Ches. If someone mamish is about to die, then you say vidoy, and even then you say, many people said vidoy, they thought they were about to die, and they didn't die. And other people didn't say vidoy, and they did die, so it's good, you should be mizvada. So you see here, the dafka, first of all, it has to be mamish, they're on the verge of passing away. Otherwise, you don't say, 30 days left to say vidoy now. That's not okay. And you have to tell them, by the way, lav dafka, it's even going to happen, because even then, the guy will be tzabaracha, even if it's an hour before they pass away. Why tell them that they're about to pass away even an hour before they pass away? Nachter Tzu and Kahelas Rabba, there's a different version of the conversation with Chizkiah and Yeshaya. There it says, Amle Chizkiah Yeshaya, he said, Yeshaya, conversationally. But Noeg Sheba'elam, the normal thing is, a person's Vavak Rachel and says, Nashemayim, they should have Rachmanis on you. And the doctor says, eat this, don't eat this, drink this, don't drink this. And even if he's about to die, he doesn't tell him, okay, say your last words, tzav lebeischa, shelo yichalish daitoi. So normal behavior of visitors, of doctors, is not to say this, and you're coming to me and telling me this. So there, it's even more glaring that Chizkiah is telling Yeshaya that a doctor doesn't say such a thing. Another ayah, Gemara in Shabbos, Herdeini Hashem, Kitzi, Midas Yomei Mahi, David wanted to know when he's going to pass away. Hashem said, no, we don't reveal that, sorry. So you see here, you can't tell a person when they're going to pass away. So he takes it as a blanket rule. Even if someone is clearly on the verge of passing away, the doctor doesn't have the right to say so. And so on and so forth in this vein. So he's very adamant that this is absolutely not Beseder. And he throws in a line about the shochet harefim, who come and tell people that their days are numbered. Betach yomas b'mehera, you're tzabrechen a person and being mitzara a person, it's not okay. It's achzorius. And later in the Sefer, in Siman Shimon Gimel, which is apparently the first half of the same Shaila, there this person asked Rav Yehuda Lavi of Kail Shari Torah, and Rav Kook is writing to him, like, I guess you're a younger man. If you're more than that, I'm sorry if I got the titles wrong. I didn't go look up to see if he was a notable person. The Shaila was, can you be mefarsim a psak din barabim? Is it lashon hara or not? Can you write in the paper about, this one went to court, went to Beis Din? So we don't have time to get into it, but Rav Klein said on the one hand, if it's not a state secret, if more than three people know about it, then it should be fine to repeat. And of course, the psak din is in front of three people, so it's not lashon hara. But that's only if it's mesiach lefi tumai or for teyalis. But if you're trying to be mevaza, be mefarsim, so then that's like being mechaven lahavid hakol legaloisoi. Then it's not okay. And then he goes on in that vein to say, so therefore, what the newspapers do is not okay. But it's interesting. I think the first half for Rav Klein is not taking the most, the broadest definition of lashon hara, which we don't have time to get into the whole sugya of lashon hara in the last 100 years, and it's its own topic, its own parsha. But to me, it was interesting that at least in the first bit, he said that if you're stam saying lefi tumai or leteyeles, then it's fine. So the question is how you phrase it. Is it by definition lashon hara, and you have to reach some kind of high bar to prove that it's not lashon hara, or by definition is it not lashon hara? But there is a bar. If you stoop below this bar, then what are you doing? Why are you spreading bad information about people? You're harming people. You're causing people hazak. So this is obviously always a very relevant thing. I think historically it was always considered normal to converse, to share basic facts and information about what's going on. If someone is summoned to Torah, it often might be relevant for people to know. But it still does come down to intent and what you're doing with it and how you're doing with it, how you're doing it. And today he's talking about newspapers then, and today with the digital tools, one has to be truthfully even more sensitive, right? You can post it on a chat of 50 people or even 25 people, and that's a big pirsum that a person couldn't really do in the past unless you went into shul and told the whole shul. Here it's much easier. So it's always something to keep in mind. And with that, we conclude the summary, the survey of the Tes Zayin Sivan in Halachic History.